Hi, and welcome to Skeptic Hangout, the place where we sit back, relax, and chit chat about intriguing and sometimes controversial topics through the lens of skepticism. The old crew is back once again, so we are Richard, and Laura with you for a second week in the Twilight Zone. Today, we are going to be discussing slavery. So grab your English tea or your chai latte breve and join us as we get into the ownership of one person over another. This is Skeptic Hangout Slavery.
The way your glass was very close to the camera, it looked like you were drinking from a very, very big glass, Gilliver.
It's a very, very big glass. That wasn't because it was close to the camera.
All
It
right,
is
just
because
It
no,
it's
it is a big
actually
glass.
is a very
an
big
actual
glass.
large glass. Yeah, it's gin o'clock in the Gilliver household.
Oh my
So, are we
goodness.
all looking forward to a really happy, joyful episode of Skeptic Hangout then? Because this is a nice light topic to.
This is gonna be heavy. Yeah, we did social class last week, and this actually ties really well into social class.
Mhm.
In terms of social stratification throughout human history and how it has negatively impacted people. And so yeah, I know that Gilliver said he had a story to start us off with, but yeah, I'm expecting this one to be a bit heavier and for us to get into some really controversial stuff. So Gilliver, take it away.
Yeah, I've been having a conversation over the last couple of days with a creationist on Twitter. And it's not something I tend to do. I tend to usually just put announcements out on Twitter. I've seemed to have got reeled into this conversation. And one of the things we've been talking about, we've touched on many subjects, but one of the things we talked about was the commands God gave. And I had from him the old excuse that it was a different Simon Plays, the well practiced the trope that kind of Christian apologists tend to give. I asked him a question, and the question was based around him saying that. In fact, let me try and remember this correctly because I don't want to misrepresent him. We were talking about God giving the command to kill lots of people and take virgin girls as spoils of war. And he said, well, that's God's command, so that's okay, essentially. So I said, right, okay, so let's transport it forward and bring it into this day and age. What if God came now and gave the command to restart up an African slave trade exactly as it was in the Americas? Would it be okay because it was God's command? And all sorts of excuses. There was quite a lot of avoiding the question going off. And all sorts of excuses came out. And I found that fascinating. The moral dilemma that a simple question like that can put someone in. And there was another kind of Christian apologist who said, yes, it would be absolutely fine because it was God's command. But the first guy and the guy was actually speaking to never actually gave me a straight answer on it. And that fascinates me. That fascinates me how people can compartmentalize the beliefs, whereas something is fine if it's done in the past, which is morally reprehensible. But if it's done in this day and age, it's by the same person or the same entity. It's somehow something that you have to struggle with.
I think it's
And
really interesting that comparison between the past and the present because I think all of us have that tendency to think about people in the past as like characters almost in a story. You know,
yeah,
obviously the Bible is one thing that you talked about as, and that is a story. It is presented as a story, but obviously Christians and other people believe it to be factual. But it's still written down as a story. You know, whether it was real or not.
Right.
You know, we can talk about events that happened
I
in
mean, I
the.
kind of disagree with that, but we'll let that one slide for
No,
for
no,
the
I don't mean
minute.
it's written, but isn't it can be read as a story? Can't you can pick up a Bible, reading from the Bible, and read it as a story, and whether
Yeah.
you view it as a historical, record, or whether you view it as an allegory or whatever, but you can certainly present it as a story. And you read histories about, like you said, the American slave trade and British slave trades and whatever. And I think because it's in the past and separated by time, it feels less real. Like you can talk about abhorrent things that happened in the past, but it doesn't have the same sort of deep guttural impact on you emotionally as if you were reading about a news article about the same thing happening now somewhere in the world.
Yeah, I was gonna say pretty much exactly that, is we have this way of dehumanizing humans that we don't have direct experience with. It was something to do with you have the most compassion for your tightest circle and then for your local town. And as you get further and further outside of your circle of influence or the people you're personally subjected to, you get less and less and less empathetic toward them. And one thing that you talk about in terms of as like wokeism, right, is the concept of feeling empathy for anybody and everybody, regardless of whether they're from another country or in a different social status or having different struggles than you, is still seeing the humanity in them. And one thing that religion is particularly good at doing is squelching that, regardless of like the preaching of God's love, right? For other people, is there's this sort of othering that allows people to distance themselves from that situation. So I think you're absolutely right. When you say something like it was okay to take girls as spoils of war, or it was okay to own slaves, or it was okay to oppress women because it was a different time, it doesn't really matter how there's a part of you that has cognitive dissonance between the love and compassion you feel as a loving and truly loving Christian. Like you might really be a loving person, and how you look back on the past and justify the actions of a really quite like abhorrent nature. And I think like Gilliver's conversation about tying it into slavery, I think that applies outside of religion as well. We have a hard time really reflecting on how bad the circumstances were for people who were subjected to slavery. And it's not just Africans with American like colonialists and stuff like that. Like that is definitely historically very recent, and it's part of our countries, like both Britain and the United States, our country's history and like near history. But slavery's been going back thousands and thousands and thousands of years. People of all colors, all races, all countries and nations had different ways of approaching slavery. I'm not saying that every country had slaves. I'm just saying that it's rampant throughout human history. And yet we have this sort of detachment to what those people actually suffered.
Well, yeah, let me. Can I just want to kind of take it off topic this early in the show already by saying that I want to be fair and say it's not just a Christian thing. This I think we all do it because we're all very quick to kind of jump on Muhammad for marrying an underage girl, and things of that nature. We must remember that in I can't speak for the US, but in Britain, it wasn't that long ago before since underage marriage was legal here.
Mm.
Right.
And since we actually ate the bodies of our dead relatives as medicine.
Right.
That's not in the distant past. And I think sometimes it's easier to kind of jump on, as you were saying, Laura, the kind of less familiar than looking our own backyard for things. So there have been kind of abhorrent occurrences throughout history and in all countries and things. It's not just an us and them thing.
Can I ask you two a question? This is with no sort of. I kind of by asking the question, it kind of presumes that I agree with the premise of the question, but I don't necessarily. Do you think there's ever a justified reason for owning another human being?
No. Like I don't even think we own our children.
I do not. I think it is a very interesting and more nuanced question than just saying I do not, though, because without jumping to the defense of Christians, their excuse is that the alternative was death for a lot of these slaves that were taken into indebted servitude. Which wasn't the only category of slavery that was endorsed by God, by the way, but that's the only one they focus on.
But that's the one they discuss, yeah.
That becomes more difficult on a general level. But we must remember that the people who are making them indebted servants are the ones who would otherwise be killing them as well. So it becomes less of a moral question and more of, it is kind of still wrong whether you kill them or like just take them as slaves. It's still wrong. Whichever you do it, just choose something nicer.
Well, yeah, the way that you say it, we're talking about the larger moral ramifications of warfare, right? Which like that's its own. We should have that as an episode soon because that's a discussion in and of itself. But when you talk about like what's really really problematic in that question and what makes it morally 100%, because I don't like 100%. I don't like black and white.
Yeah.
I'm all about shades of gray. I'm all about nuance. But there's certain words, like when you talk about the word rape, well, that's been defined as hurting someone and taking away their autonomy and taking away their choice, right? And so you can say, based on the definition of rape, that it's always 100% of the time morally wrong, period. And if the human race needs to die off because she's the last female and you need to have babies with her to save the human race, then the human race dies off, period, right? When you say ownership, it's the same thing. When you put that word into the question, like, is it ever okay for a human to own another human? What's problematic is the word own. I was thinking, a lot of people say like, well, I have my children and they're my responsibility and I have control over them until they turn 18 because they're my kids. Like there's a sense of ownership over them. I don't even believe that. I believe that we have responsibilities to our children. We don't have rights to ownership over our children. Right. And I know that there are people who will, like, depending on the wordage, will vehemently disagree with me that that people do have choices that they can make for their children because that they're theirs, right? When you talk about owning another human being, you're talking about making decisions for them, taking away their autonomy, taking away their rights to choose what they want to do.
Because the
And
distinction there is with our own children, we don't own them, but we have responsibilities for them. And often
yeah,
we're in a better position to be able to make responsible choices for their benefit, and it's a different situation, isn't it, to the one you're talking about?
yeah, but even with children, like when you talk about people who will say things like, well, my child can't talk about or discuss the fact that they're gay, or my child can't wear a certain kind of clothing because I'm against it. Like my child can't have this form of expression or make that kind of choice. Um, there are a lot of choices that children don't realize really what they're making. They don't really have the cognitive ability to say, well, this is a bad decision versus a good decision. And so having that kind of guidance or setting those guidelines is really, really important. But when you start talking about taking away their freedom as a human being and dehumanizing them, that's kind of what I'm talking about. And we'd like to think that as parents, there's nobody out there like that, but that's common. Like I see
That's
it commonly.
that's what my children would describe when I try and make them eat vegetables, for example. I
I don't know. That's a whole nother nuanced way of looking at it too, right? In terms of trying to teach kids how to be healthy, right? But no, like when you talk about like ownership of a human being, when you start to get to a point where, well, you own them, but what you're really doing is they're working for you and you're providing this and that, but they have the choice to leave and da 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 da. And you start to add on these qualifiers that make it not sound so bad. Well, at that point, it's not ownership. You're just saying you own that person when you don't. And um, so then you're trying to kind of create a picture of like, well, see, look, it's okay because we're allowing this, we're allowing that, we're allowing this. Well, then you don't really own them. Um, or you do own them, you're just tying pretty bows around it. Like you're taking the chains and you're like lining them with velvet and like, and you're serving their moldy bread on a silver platter, right? But no, you do in fact still own them, and it is in fact still wrong. So it's really interesting how I think no matter which way you look at it, that term is wrong 100% of the time.
I agree. I think slavery. I think owning another person is always wrong in that regard.
So I have a counter question. You're talking about like the penile system, right? I said that wrong. Penile means penis. The oh my God, what is it? The prison system.
Penal.
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 The penal system.
That was nearly a whole
That's
different show.
great. We almost switched topics onto something completely more interesting and less
And I was
controversial.
worried about taking it off topic.
Well, you see, Laura a few minutes ago was talking about how many shades of grey she likes. So, I mean,
exactly. But no, if you talk about the penal system and like, okay, this person committed murder or this person is not safe in society, so we're going to take them and we're going to force them to work for society. Where do you guys think that falls in terms of like forced labor as a form of slavery for punishment of crimes? Like, do you guys think that that makes it morally okay, or where do you guys fall on that?
We should distinguish between and I'm not familiar with all the nuances of the penile penal system. So I don't know if I'm speaking slightly out of turn here, but I think we should distinguish between, and I know in Britain, prisoners get paid for the work they do in prison.
That's good.
And I presume they do in other countries as well. I'm not sure. It might be at a reduced rate, but I think there's a difference between somebody who's made a social contract. We've all made social contracts with society. We all agree to live in society. And there's got to be some form of rehabilitation if you break that contract. And the prison systems are a long, long way from perfect.
Absolutely.
I don't think it's a fair comparison to call them slavery.
No, but I think this is really... So your question, Laura, has really sort of exploded in my brain.
Yes.
So I think it would be really legitimate to ask Gilliver, like, do we have a choice to live in... Like, I don't have a choice about...
Yes, you do.
Right, okay.
Yes, you do. Yes, you do. You can sell all your possessions and go and live on an island and live off the land. You might not be doing it legally, but you can do it anytime you choose to do it. We don't do it because it's hard. It's more comfortable living like this.
That's almost like that's a whole problematic discussion that might take us down like that. I almost want to shelve that for another show, because now you're talking about social agreements that you're kind of born into, and you do feel kind of forced to accept them. So I kind of empathize a lot with what Gil's trying to say. But do we really have the choice or don't? That's a more complicated answer than just a plain yes or no. So I don't know.
But then so let's put ourselves in the past, in say America, while there was slavery and black people were in servitude in America. Like, the social contract, in inverted commas, that we talked about is that is the status quo, and that's the sort of way things are. In Britain nowadays, if I decide to murder somebody according to the social contract, therefore I lose my freedoms. I may have to, all the things you were talking about, Laura, in terms of the penal system. But similarly, in the past, when all that sort of stuff was going on, that was also the social contract that everybody...
No, because the slaves didn't have a social contract. They had no choice. You have a choice whether to murder someone or not.
I do.
A slave doesn't have a choice whether to become a slave.
Yeah, a slave doesn't have a choice, but we don't have a lot of choices either. Like, if we decide, I don't believe in the way that land ownership works according to the social contracts of everybody else in the country I live in, I'm going to build a house in this park, or I'm going to just like live out of my van and sleep in this parking lot because I'm not harming anybody. I'm not taking up resources. I'm just doing my own thing. You can get arrested for vagrancy or homelessness,
but people
or trespassing
do it.
or any number of things.
In Britain,
but they get punished for it. They reject the social contract and then they get punished for it. So in a way, the choice is almost false. Like, sure, you can make the choice to go otherwise, but then there's consequences that you don't agree. Like, okay, if I stop doing this, I accept that this will be my consequence. Instead, it's like, here's the social contract that you have to accept. Well, I'm not going to accept it. Okay, well, then here's a punishment.
I don't think, and please, anybody correct me on this, but I don't think it's actually, in Britain at least, illegal to be homeless. I don't think it's I think it's illegal to kind of deposit yourself on private property to try and seek shelter and things. But I don't think being homeless in and of itself is illegal.
But that wasn't my example. Wasn't just being homeless, which can be inside or outside somebody's control. Oftentimes, I think it's outside of the person's control.
I think most of the times it's outside of it. Yeah, I'm using a very extreme example.
Exactly. Yeah, and so I'm definitely not. I'm not discussing homelessness. I'm discussing the rejection of social contracts. So you say I don't believe in property ownership the way that this social contract that this town, state, nation has over property laws. I reject that, and I'm gonna live by my own property laws, and I'm going to set up my property where I want to, right? And I'm going to do a contract with myself that I think is the right way to live. You're bumping up against city ordinances, laws, regulations, and you don't have a choice. Like, you can't tell them, nope, I never agreed to that social contract, right?
Yeah, I don't have an option to just not pay a council tax because I never agreed to pay to it in the pay in the first place. I would get a court summons and whatever. It's
It's complicated. Yeah. And I'm not saying I fully disagree with you, Gilliver. I think people do have more choices often than we think we have, but I don't think we have quite as many. I'm kind of narrowing down what you're trying to say and say, well, there is lanes, by which we have to acknowledge.
What is
I'm just trying to keep this in line with the subject of slavery. And the comparison to that, though, rather than make it a conversation about choices in and of itself. And that's the angle I'm coming from.
Yeah.
We have a choice in that regard to reject that social contract if we want to. We can do it to an extent. If you're a slave, you do not have that choice.
Yeah, you
are the property of someone else.
Yeah.
And you have no social contract with that person. You are their property. And that's the point I'm trying to make, I know we went on a bit of a tangent, which was probably my fault for bringing up a bad example. that was the comparison I was trying to make.
No, I think that's a valid one. I think that makes a lot more sense. Saying that we have varying degrees of control and slavery removes all control.
Oh, I was just going to say there's been a lot of talk recently, in Britain at least, to do with the sort of after effects of slavery and the sort of legacies of slavery. So there's been, and I think this happened to some degrees in America as well, I'm not sure, where, for example, places that were named after big slave owners or statues of slave owners and things are being sort of removed by people because people want to distance themselves from colonial horrors, of the past. And, it's really easy nowadays to forget that lots of the riches of the Western world were, won on the whipped backs of slaves. And it's really easy to distance ourselves from that reality. That lots, we walk into an amazing building and forget that it was paid for by slavery, or we walk, see amazing. Do you know the point I'm making? Like it's something that's in the past and historical that we think about, but it's still no. Hang on, I'll change what I'm saying, because slavery is still a thing in the modern age, but we don't see it in front of our eyes. But the things we do see in front of our eyes to do with slavery are sort of echoes of the past, and they sort of carrying on being relevant. And I don't know what your two thoughts are in terms of, if there is a building named after an important slave owner who was very rich but did lots of good things off the back of that, should we therefore, remove that man's name or that man's image from things? Or
I think glorifying it in any way is probably something that could do with being done without, at the very least. At the very least, if we go into, for example, a historic building, which I did recently in Glasgow, and which may have been built off the back of the slave trade, at least acknowledge that publicly. And if it's a public building where public can make that known and make that thing. And another thing, of course, is which is a bigger thing in the US, and I think, than it is here, is reparations. We need to reimburse the descendants of those people who were wronged. And it's easy to say, well, no, we shouldn't, because that's them and that's the past. But oftentimes it has a very real effect. You only have to look at the statistics, and I don't have them to hand, but I've done enough non-profit shows to have read lots of them. Black people in the US are disadvantaged largely because of the slave trade, and they came from, and they've got this kind of inherent racism against them. And, reparations is a good way of trying. It's not going to solve the problems of the past, and I don't think anybody's going to pretend that it is. But it is going to make a gesture of beginning to build bridges and acknowledge the wrongs done in the past. And I don't think there's any doubt that that's the right thing to do whatsoever, in my mind.
Yeah, so I want to come back to reparations, because I really want to respond to Gil's and to your comments on identifying figures in the past, like naming buildings or making statues after them, And then it turns out that, like, despite their contributions, they also have negative moral um, bits to them that we want to kind of not erase, but we want to acknowledge that, hey, that makes that person not as great as we thought they were. Our biggest problem with that is like what I don't know if there's a more appropriate title for it, but I'm going to call it hero worship. We have got to stop glorifying the people of our past because that gets us more in trouble. Like, so we have the founding fathers and like people worship them the way they worship characters in the Bible in the United States. Like our founding fathers are like, see no evil, do no evil, speak no evil. And they're really, really, really admired in the
As
United
opposed
States.
to being like humans, for
As
example.
opposed to being humans. And
Yeah.
they owned slaves and they treated their women like shit. And actually, if you look into the founding of the United States, there was multiple governments and there was failures and there was multiple drafts of the documents. And we kind of see it as like this glorified golden era where God just came down and placed the Constitution in our laps and said, here's a great form of government, right? And it was a shit show in the beginning. And but we have this tendency, like we're gonna name this after George Washington, we're gonna put them on our money, and we kind of shoot ourselves in the foot. So I'm not saying we should like I'm kind of with Gilliver where it's like you don't need to name the building after them in the first place. Don't erase them from history. Don't fail to talk about them. Don't fail to acknowledge what they did do. Like when you talk about a social studies class or a history class or studying economics, bring their names up, discuss them, say what they did well, talk about how they advanced society, and also talk about the bad things that happened that they did to advance society, like the cotton trade. Talk about how it was only advanced because of slavery and how that was morally the wrong. Sure, we shot generations forward in terms of our technology in the cotton industry, but we did so in an immoral way that if you are talking about human suffering as being the number one mark of progress, then maybe the cotton industry should have moved slower. Maybe we shouldn't have had these great advancements. Maybe these leaps forward could have been done slower and in a more moral way. But let's at least discuss it. We don't need to glorify people and then have this huge argument back and forth about like, well, do we put up like arguments over generals in the Civil War? Like, well, they're a general of the South and we should just erase them and we should take down all the monuments. Well, I how does that not apply to George Washington? Like all those arguments you have against that general, a lot of them apply to George Washington, right? So I'm not even okay, let's allow the general because we have George Washington. I'm saying why do we have to have monuments to any of them? Like I think our hero worship of people of the past really goes too far. And then we get really sensitive at the idea of saying anything bad about them or not naming buildings after them or taking down their it's like a heresy to take down a statue. Like it's some affront to humanity. And I'm just wondering what your guys' thoughts are on that.
Yeah, I think the hero worship thing that you talked about is really interesting because um just I think a lot of the time it feeds into people's identities as well, doesn't it? And so, if there's a character from the past that you've particularly admired because of, the great things they've done, it almost sort of eats away at you if you also then kind of have to accept that there are negative things about them. A good example, not necessarily specifically to slavery in Britain, is like Winston Churchill, for example. People idolize Winston Churchill because he made those glorious speeches. He won us the war. But he was also an incredibly racist man and an incredibly misogynistic, sexist man. And again, like we said earlier, people in the past are still people, like nowadays, who have flaws, who have strengths, who have done great things and terrible things. And I think it's important that we see things in that way. So yeah,
education, yeah. Forgetting about the bad things that people have done is I think the problem. Acknowledge the good and acknowledge the bad, because we get things like, here's an example that links directly to slavery. A lot of people acknowledge, and rightly so, it has to be said, that Christians were largely involved in abolishing the slave trade.
Sure, yeah, absolutely.
That does not mean that Christianity supports abolishing the slave trade, because I've read 2 books. I've written them down because my memory is crap and I didn't want to forget them. So I've read a couple of books and pamphlets in the past, and there are many, many, many more by Christians during the slave trade who used the Bible, just like those did that abolished the slave trade and quoted the Bible to give an argument for abolishing it, who used the Bible to endorse the slave trade. In 1861, there was a book called Scriptural, Ecclesiastical, and Historical View of Slavery by John Henry Hopkins. And there was a guy called Thornton Stringfellow who wrote too in 1850, a brief examination of scripture and testimony on the institution of slavery. And in 1856, Scriptural and Statistical Views in Favor of Slavery. So, let's acknowledge that, yes, there were Christians who wanted to abolish slavery, and there were also those who wanted to keep it going, and they both used the Bible to justify that position. Both sets of people, and that goes, like we've just been saying, for historical figures, that, acknowledge the good things they did. But let's also acknowledge the shit that Winston Churchill did and the Founding Fathers did. And let's educate people on that as well, because that is how you stop making mistakes in future. You don't not make mistakes by whitewashing and covering up mistakes from the past.
Right.
You stop making mistakes by educating people about them and taking them on board and learning from that.
Yeah,
Richard,
no, and
Laura.
let's actually, I have something to say, but I want Richard to go first because I don't want to take up too much of the time.
I don't have anything immediately to say, so go for it.
Well, I kind of wanted to say how that kind of comes back around to the conversation about reparations, because you talk about like the good and the bad, right? And that was the second thing I wanted to talk about, because you had mentioned reparations and how appropriate they are. And I just wanted, and you said, like, I'm not sure how they are in the United States. Well, they're shit. They're so bad. It's terrible. So yes, reparations have been made to, I don't know the extent that reparations are made to descendants of the slaves, but I know that descendants of Native Americans, I did a study on that in my anthropology degree, and it's terrible. They gave land to the Native Americans and then took it away. They gave land and then like did things on that land, or they gave money and then said, well, we're going to manage it for you, and then mismanaged it. Right. And there's all these arguments about, well, who gets the money and how does it get distributed? And that causes problems. So I'm all about the concept of making reparations for people harmed in the past. And I'm all about acknowledging that the human tendency to do terrible things in the past does not excuse it for the present, and that any amount of trying to make things better for the descendants is a good thing. I don't ever see that as a bad thing. But the way that we handle reparations makes them almost, I don't want to say more harmful, because I'm not a member of those groups and it hasn't personally impacted me, so I can't say that. But reading about how it's distributed, how the government has handled it, how the people are impacted by it is cringy. Like it made me sick, like angry on behalf of these people.
Yeah.
So I don't know. I don't
think
know where
there's a relatively simple solution to that. Let us as people and let the government as the government agree to give the people reparations. And then instead of us deciding how that money's spent, let the people who it's given to decide how it's spent. And I think that's a relatively simple solution to that. There are going to be ways in which that needs to be managed, but let those people manage it. I
Simple
don't need
solutions
to stick...
and government don't necessarily match up, though, in the same sentence.
I was about to say there's so much wrong with what you're saying, not in principle, but in practice. Right?
Yeah. No, I
mean,
agree.
It's always about like it's a human problem, right? Like it sounds good when we talk about it hypothetically, but then you get humans involved and we dick it all up. Like we tend to mess things up all the time. And I think reparations
we've talked a lot in this show about obviously slavery as a historical issue, and I know we're coming up to the last few minutes of the show, but it certainly isn't an issue which is solely in the past and doesn't exist presently, and so
right.
It's not in front of our eyes all the time. But in the UK, and I certainly have zero statistics about this or specific information, but I'm sure it's easily searchable. You hear things in the news about modern slavery, where people are trafficked into countries and forced to work in factories and never see anybody. And there are things like that happening in Britain today. That's sort of clandestine and hidden away. It's not part of how society is structured nowadays, at least in the UK and the USA specifically. But it still happens here and certainly does elsewhere in the world. So
and it must be pointed out as well that there are both inter and intra-country slave trades going off.
yeah.
It's not just a case of human trafficking from one country to another. There's actually human trafficking going on within countries as well.
Yeah, so I think it's obviously something we've focused on as a historical issue, and rightly so, because it features quite heavily in human history.
In our past.
But yeah, certainly the ongoing struggles against slavery are still in existence, and it's something that certainly should be focused on there too. But I don't have any specific information to back up anything I'm saying at the moment. So.
No, but I've actually done volunteer work with human trafficking organizations, and I've worked with people who work for human trafficking, like anti-human trafficking organizations, to be clear. The organizations that try to stop them. I realize I said that a little bit wrong. But so I absolutely know that it still happens, and it happens within my state. And there's big initiatives in my state to push back against that. So I think that's a great place to end it on. I know that we're coming up to the end of the show, but just to really nail home that, like, no matter what we talked about in terms of the past and slavery in the past, is it ever moral? Like, how do groups justify it and all that stuff? Those are all great conversations. But just, I like the idea of leaving you audience with the thought of how does slavery impact us today, and can we spend some uncomfortable moments thinking about that and talking about that and what can be done about it. So closing thoughts, guys. What are your thoughts?
Apparently we don't have thoughts.
Oh no.
Slavery is an issue today, and it's a multifaceted issue as well. It's not just a black and white evangelical Christical argument of invested servitude is good, chattel slavery is bad. It's a lot. All slavery is bad. All owning people is bad. So go onto our Facebook discussion group and discuss it and let you know what us think and correct us if we are wrong. The most important thing, as always, Gil, got about 20 seconds.
Well, yeah, probably less. I think my sort of predominant thought is trying to think myself about historically, humans not being characters and actually being people and empathizing with the plights that have taken place.
All right. On that note, keep questioning.
Interrogate your beliefs.
And stay skeptical.
Bye.